So I wanted to start our time today with a preface story, an anecdote from seminary. So there was a New Testament professor in seminary who was a terrific lecturer. One day in class, he started the lecture by asking, he was very understated too, by the way, what if I told you that there was one book out there that is probably the best book on the New Testament? As you can imagine, the entire lecture hall sat up in their seats, waiting for him to unveil the title of the book. Everyone had their fingers ready, alert and ready to record the title and author of the book into their laptops, into their notebooks or phones or what have you. And he said, "The best book ever written on the New Testament, which is the greatest guide to understanding the teachings of Jesus, the writings of all four Gospels, and Paul and the apostles, the best book to read if you wanted to understand them," he said, was, you probably already know, the Old Testament. Okay? I tell you this story to point out that if you think about it, if you really think about it, the entire Bible sustains a singular theme, kind of, if you will, like a love letter from God to his people, revealing God's promise made to us and that promise kept for us. You see, the good news of Jesus Christ that we find in the New Testament is anchored in the Old Testament. To see the two testaments in conversation with one another means to see the fullness of the promise and the fullness of Jesus Christ. So today, I'm going to do something a little different, okay? I was really nervous about this, but I'm going to do something different. I'm going to simply tell you 3 stories from the Bible. 2 from the New Testament, and 1 from the Old. Okay? And I'm going to do this in hopes that as you listen to these stories, you will listen for how God might reveal God's heart to you today. And I'm going to ask you to do this by taking these stories and then weaving your own into it. Okay? So we're going to start in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24. We're starting in the New Testament, and this is the passage we heard earlier. So I'm going to ask you, imagine with me these women rising so early in the morning, going on their way to the tomb where Jesus was laid 2 days prior. We're told that they were with Jesus since the very beginning of his ministry, where he started off in Galilee. And these women weren't mere followers of Jesus, but they were witnesses of his teaching, of his miracles, of his healings. And some of them, if you know, were recipients of his healing, such as Mary Magdalene, who had 7 demons cast out of her. And these women saw it all, didn't they? Not only the healing, the miracles, the wondrous teaching, but they also saw when the crowds had turned on Jesus, when Jesus was scorned and then crucified. They watched as the one whom they thought was the promised Messiah suffered under the hands of sinful people. So, can you imagine when Jesus was crucified and hanging on the cross, what those hours of seeing him hanging there might have been like for them? I really imagine that those hours of him hanging on the cross felt like protracted loops of, why, God? Where are you in any of this? Why give us such hope in you only to have our hope die? Why? These women didn't leave Jesus while he lived, and they surely were not leaving him when he died. But I ask you, very simple question. What if the story ended there? What if their story simply ended with them realizing that the hope that they had in Jesus was a false hope? He was a good teacher, yes, but not the promised Messiah. So again, I'm asking you, what if the story ended there? I'm sure you can imagine that it would be very difficult for these women to recover from such a complete devastation. I mean, it's hard to recover from disappointment on such a high level, and I know many of us here know that. We've experienced such disappointment. It would be hard to imagine that the next time any glimmer of any extraordinary hope arose, I'm sure there's a lot of hardening of heart, a suppression of wanting to trust again. Because honestly, how do you recover? Or how do you move on when your hope is now buried in a tomb? How do you move on when your heart is sealed with disappointment? So, what if the story ended there? Now come with me to a second story. A second story that we find in 2 Kings chapter 4. Consider with me, this is a story way before Jesus came to the world, where the prophet Elisha enters this remote town of Shunem. There's a map for you. Where a well-to-do married woman urges Elisha to stay with her at her house whenever he comes to the town, right? And we're told that this Shunammite, that is really all that she's called. She has no name in the Bible. She's only referred to by the place she lived. Okay? And we are told that this Shunammite one day says to her husband, "You know, I know that this man, Elisha, who often comes our way, is a holy man of God. Let's make him a small room on the roof of our house." By the way, the roof is prime, real estate. That's where you want to be. Not only are we going to give him a room, let's put a bed in there. As if that wasn't enough, she says, let's put a table. As if that weren't enough, she says, let's put a chair. And if that weren't enough, she said, let's put a lamp. And then he could stay there whenever he comes. This is a tremendous act of hospitality. And again, this is something that many of us here have experienced and have also given. And so the story goes that one day when Elisha comes into town, and he's now in that room that she made for him, and he's thinking, and he's lying down on his bed, and he says to his servant Gehazi, call the Shunammite. So Gehazi goes and delivers his master's message and tells her what the message wants her to know. You have gone through all this trouble for us. Now, what can be done for you? Can we speak on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the armies? Meaning, what do you need? We want to do something for you. And the Shunammite replies, it's a very odd answer. I have a home among my own people. It's an odd answer, but it's such a lovely answer. She's saying, no, I don't have any needs. I am more than comfortable, and I have no request to make of the king or to any commander of army. I'm good. So Gehazi goes and delivers the message to his master Elisha, but Elisha doesn't accept it because he's so moved to wanting to do something for her that he ponders, what can be done for her? So then Gehazi, such an attentive servant, by the way, says to his master, well, she has no son, and her husband is old. In other words, she will be a widow shortly, and she has no means of retaining her wealth. Because as it goes, once her husband is dead, she has no rightful heir to inherit his wealth, and therefore will have no one who can take care of her. She will be faced with destitution. So when Gehazi makes known this fact to his master, well, then Elisha says, call her. So Gehazi brings the Shunammite to Elisha, and she stands at the doorway of the room on the roof. And I do love that image of her just standing at the doorway, not even coming in the room, just standing there. And without coming into the room, as she stands there, Elisha says, this time, next year, you will hold a son in your arms. And the Shunammite replies, no, my lord. And then she continues to object and says, don't mislead your servant, O man of God. I pause here to ask you, how many disappointments do you suppose this Shunammite have experienced in her life? How many times do you suppose she hoped to be pregnant with a son? What could cause her to tell this man of God, do not raise my hopes for something which I have hoped for so long, but now have been resigned to any hope of any possibility? I ask you, how many secret letdowns might she have encountered along the way that now she would shun the blessing spoken over her? And so imagine with me the mix of emotions this Shunammite must have experienced when it finally dawns on her, right? Oh my goodness, I'm pregnant. And then, without knowing the gender of the child, is it a boy? It's unlike today. We can find out the gender as early as, I hear, 11 weeks. That's astounding. But for her faith must have been tested for the duration of her pregnancy. Maybe she hoped despite herself. But lo and behold, just as it was spoken over her, she gave birth to a son. And this child, who must have been so loved by his parents, grew to be a young boy. And one day, this young boy goes out to the field to his father, because his father's out there with the reapers during the harvest. And suddenly, this child cries out to his father, my head, my head. And so his father tells the servant, carry him to his mother. And so the servant takes him to his mother. And his mother, the Shunammite, holds this young boy on her lap until noon. And then he dies. His mother, the Shunammite, carries her son up to the roof to Elisha's room. Though she knows that Elisha's not there, he's in Mount Carmel. But she puts him on the bed, puts him on the man of God's bed. She shuts the door and she leaves the house. She tells her husband, please, send me out with one of the servants and a donkey so I can go to the man of God quickly and return. This is bizarre, don't you think? She doesn't tell the husband that their son is dead, that the son's lying on the bed. She's determined to do something. What is she so determined to do? She saddles the donkey and says to a servant, lead on. Don't slow down for me unless I tell you." So the two of them ride off toward Mount Carmel. Now Elisha sees the Shunammite coming from a distance, and so he sends his servant again, right, to run down to meet her. And Gehazi then asks her, "Are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your child all right?" And she answers, "Everything is all right." She didn't tell her husband that the son was dead, and she's not telling Gehazi that the son is dead. She holds herself back. She's determined. She's going to bring it straight to the man of God himself. And when she finally reaches Elisha, she falls to the ground, takes hold of his feet. And Gehazi, the servant, comes over, pushes her away, most like just a desire to want to protect his master from a woman who seems mad. But Elisha says, "Leave her alone. She is in bitter distress, but the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me why." Don't you love how God gives the Shunammite the opportunity to speak what is on her mind? And so the Shunammite speaks why she has come all that distance to, and what she wanted to say to him. She says to him, "Did I ask for a son, my Lord? Didn't I tell you, do not give me false hope?" So I'm going to ask you again, what if the story ended there? Can you imagine if the story ended there? So then now I ask you to follow me to the third and last story, found in the New Testament, Luke chapter 7, where we see Jesus entering the town of Nain. Nain, in the time of Jesus, was about 1 to 5 kilometers from where the town of Shunem is in Elisha's time. So pretty much the same place. And here in Nain, Jesus enters with his disciples, accompanied by a large crowd. So it's not just his disciples. He's got all these followers going with him, which, again, you could presume includes the women who would follow Jesus from Galilee and be the ones who would prepare the spice and ointment for his burial. So now as Jesus approaches this gate, a dead young man is being carried out to be buried. And this young man is the only son of a mother who is a widow. And there's a sizable crowd, we are told, that is going with them. And so I want you to imagine Jesus entering the gate. So he's entering as a funeral procession is coming out. Imagine the crowd of followers around Jesus and the crowd of mourners who flank the coffin. And as these two crowds converge at the gate, the one crowd with Jesus in the center and the other with the dead son, at this gate, an exchange is about to happen. I don't want to spend too much time on the significance of gates, but really, really simply put, in the Bible, it's at the gate that justice was administered. It is at the gate where civil disputes were settled and claimed. But in this moment, we're told that in the midst of all the clamor of people, the Lord saw her, the widow. and he had compassion for her and said to her, out of everybody, do not go on weeping. In other words, amid the crowding together of so many people, Jesus' heart fell on this widow. And out of everybody in the crowd, he calls her out. And in calling her out, he's acknowledging that she has not been forgotten. He knows that the death of an only son is an economic catastrophe for any widow. He knows that she would have no legal inheritance, and being deprived of her son's economic support, she would be dependent on charity. So the Gospel of Luke tells us that Jesus had compassion for her. I'm going to tell you, this word compassion really literally means to be moved as to one's bowels. You see, compassion is a visceral gut punch. Ooh, you feel it. In English, the word compassion is a noun, but in the original language, the word that is used here is what is called a stative verb, meaning that it tells you the state of thought or the emotion that the subject is experiencing. So in other words, what Jesus is experiencing is he is feeling her pain. Jesus is experiencing a pain, a pang in his gut. And Jesus is so moved that he does something that causes a real public stir. He comes forward and he touches the coffin. And in doing so, the pallbearers, in my head when I see it, come to a visually screeching halt. They all stop. Why? Because the whole crowd knows that according to Jewish purity law, touching the dead was forbidden. And anyone who did would have to undergo a purification process, and you are just called unclean. You're unclean. Therefore, no one in their right mind would be so brazen enough to touch a coffin. And so when Jesus comes forward and touches the dead, what he has essentially done is he has made himself unclean. You see, at the gate, where people are judged and justified, this great exchange is made, where the uncleanliness of the dead has now transferred onto Jesus and thus remains on him. Jesus intentionally, out of compassion, takes on the consequences for the sake of this widow. And so with all eyes on him, Jesus then addresses the dead man and says, "Young man, I say to you, rise." And the dead man sits up and he begins to speak. And the gospel writer is sure to remind us of what Jesus did next. Jesus gave him to his mother. And we are told that the crowds are seized with fear, And they began to glorify God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us." You see, everyone thought that the prophet Elijah or the prophet Elisha had come. They didn't know who Jesus was. And they didn't know that he is far greater than the prophet Elijah or Elisha. They didn't know that Jesus was going from town to town on his way to enter the final gate in Jerusalem, with the purpose of taking on more than just the few that he had touched and healed. But I've gone ahead of the story. So we're going to go back and pick up from where we left off with the story with the Shunammite. See, we know that Elisha in that story goes back with the Shunammite to her house. And he goes to the upper room and he lays his body on the body of the boy. He puts his mouth on the boy's mouth. He puts his eyes on the boy's eyes. And he puts his hands on the boy's hands and he stretches himself out on the boy. You see, Elisha assumes the posture of someone who is taking the place of the boy. Kind of an exchange. And it is such a tender and intimate act of compassion. And so Elisha raises the boy back to life. And then he calls the Shunammite, and when she comes to him, we are told, and again, same thing as with Jesus, Elisha gives him to his mother. You see, Elisha raising the boy back to life is a foretaste of what is to come through Jesus. For on the cross, Jesus himself is stretched out for not just one, but for all. Moreover, unlike his predecessors, Elisha or Elijah, the extent of Jesus' compassion and the power, and this is where the real power is, the power to save takes him to the cross, to suffer and die, the results of which is our salvation, transferring his life to us, taking on our sin and death in exchange. And so, let us finally go back to our first story. Let us go back to the tomb, where the women arrive at early dawn to anoint Jesus' body. They come with all their hopes shattered, but their love for Jesus still intact. They knew they had to wait a whole day to go back to the tomb because, you see, these were faithful women, God-fearing women who observed the Sabbath. They observed the Sabbath law that forbid them to do work. Work meaning preparing any of the material to anoint Jesus. They observed the Sabbath law by not coming into contact with a dead body. And having waited, can you imagine waiting a whole day? They came at their very earliest, so very early in the morning. And when they got there, they found the stone rolled away. And when they went to the tomb, the body's not there. And suddenly the two men in dazzling white clothes are standing beside them, and they're terrified. But these angels tell the women, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. but has risen. And then the angel says something very curious to them. The angel says, "Remember?" As if they had forgotten something they already knew. The angel tells the woman, "Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee," pointing to the fact that he had said so from the beginning, that he, the Son of Man, must be delivered into the hand of sinful men and be crucified, and the third day rise again. And then Luke tells us in verse 8 that the women remembered. I'm going to tell you, one of my very favorite words in the Bible is the word remember. Whether in the Old Testament, zakar, I love that word, or in the New, remember. It is the singular, most instructive word in the Bible, I think. You see, we are a forgetful people. We forget so easily how Jesus has set the ending of all our stories. It is finished. And in our moments of hardship, it is so hard to remember the hope that has been promised to us. The promise that the hardships that we are in really is not the end. It's not the end. There's something about the angel telling the women to remember that Jesus had from the beginning already told them the whole story. That he would be delivered, yes, into the hands of sinful men. Yes, that he would be crucified. But yes, and amen, that on the third day would rise again. You see, Jesus told them the best part of all, the ending. That death would not keep him, and that hope of resurrection is the final end. Jesus told them from the beginning, the end. So I entreat you, dear friends, let us not forget the end of the story. I know, believe me, I know that in the thick of hardship, really, sometimes in the thick of disappointment, we grow really impatient. And we tend to think, why God? But like the Shunammite, like the widow of Nain, like these women who followed Jesus from Galilee from the very beginning, when we are in the thick of our hopelessness, we need to remember that Jesus said to wait and see. It's not over yet. Your story, the hardship of life, they're not the end of the story. You just need to keep remembering. Remember, the promise he made is a promise that by his word, and there's no stronger word than that, he will keep. That God has always intended to save, not to abandon or to forsake his promise. You see, when we come to church on Sundays, each Sunday, we are actually called to gather. And what we are called to gather to do you know what it is? To remember. Remember. When the psalmist says in Psalm 103, when the psalmist calls out and says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not his benefits. Don't forget. Worship is about remembering. We are asked to remember, to acknowledge him in every aspect, corner, and hidden places of our lives. And in the act of remembering, we are in fact praising him. When Jesus tells us to break bread and share a meal with one another as often as we meet, which is what the Lord's Supper is, he tells us to do this, if you recall. He says to do this in remembrance of me. In other words, don't forget all the benefits we gain through him, and there are so many countless ones. And I'm going to tell you, those benefits are amazing, things that you won't even expect, such as when we come on Sundays. If you look at the people here, you got to ask yourself, in any other time and space would this group of people gather? I say this because oftentimes I wonder, what commonality do we all share? You know? There's only one common denominator, and that's Jesus Christ, whom we say we serve, love, and trust in. That only through him can such a diverse group of people gather weekly is remarkable. Friends, these stories do not end in hopelessness. They don't end in despair. They end in the resurrection hope because God, who loves us, came in the flesh, walked among us, walked to the road to Jerusalem, dying in Golgotha. And in doing so, what he did was he stopped our march, our procession toward death and hopelessness. And he touched us as we were yet still sinners. And by stretching himself out as a public display of grace, he covers our bodies with his. He takes away our end and gives us the benefits of his inheritance and gives us a new end. And through the resurrection hope that he gives, he is able to change our stories. Through his resurrection, our stories no longer need to end in death and despair. Our hearts are no longer trapped in a tomb of death. His love is far greater and has conquered death. So that when we are told, he is risen, it is possible for us to say in agreement, in response, yes, he is risen indeed. He lives in me. No trial or hardship has the final word in our lives because Jesus is the final word. Remember? We all know this. Remember, he told you this from the first time you said you would follow him. Remember. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.